My name is Richard, and for 45 years, I was treated like a ghost by my own family. They thought I was too weak to uncover the truth about millions of dollars stolen from my inheritance. But they completely underestimated my fighting spirit and my thirst for justice. This is the story of how I turned decades of humiliation into the greatest victory of my life. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. For 45 years, I was treated like a ghost in my own family. I'm 65, and for almost half a century, I've learned that blood can be colder than ice. It all started when my father decided I wouldn't be the successor to the family business, preferring my younger brother, Marcus, who always had the gift of gab and the ready smile I never managed to achieve. Family gatherings took place without me. Important decisions were made in my absence, and when I arrived, the silence hung heavy in the air like a thick fog. My mother looked away when I tried to talk. My sister Caroline responded with monosyllables, and Marcus simply ignored me completely. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and homemade cake that had once welcomed me now felt like torture, because I knew I wasn't welcome in the environment I once called home. For years, I tried to understand what I had done wrong, replaying every conversation, every gesture, every word that could have caused this gradual drifting apart. My ex-wife, Margaret, used to call me paranoid, but when she too withdrew and filed for divorce, claiming I was emotionally absent, I began to question whether there really was something wrong with me. Loneliness became my constant companion, and the empty house echoed with the sound of my own footsteps. "Richard, could you please not come to Sunday dinner? It'll just be family," Caroline said on the phone the last time I tried to reach out. The coldness in her voice cut deeper than any knife, and I realized that to them, I hadn't been part of the family for a long time. I hung up the phone without answering, the bitter taste of rejection burning in my throat like a bad pill you're forced to swallow. The humiliation of being treated like a stranger by people who shared my last name became a wound that never healed. Every forgotten birthday, every uninvited Christmas, and every piece of family news that reached me through third parties was like salt being rubbed into raw flesh. I began to wonder if my father had left something in writing, some explanation for this treatment, some reason that justified decades of indifference. It was a rainy Tuesday in October that everything changed. The phone rang at 9 in the morning, and a formal female voice on the other end said, "Mr. Richard? I'm from Anderson and Associates Attorneys at Law. We need to talk to you about some documents we found related to your father's estate. Could you come to our office today?" The smell of old paper and pen ink filled my nostrils as attorney Sarah Anderson opened a yellowed envelope. The office had the solemn atmosphere of a place where important secrets are revealed, with dark wooden shelves filled with legal codes and the muffled sound of traffic outside creating an urban soundtrack to the moment. My shirt clung to my back with nervous sweat, and I could hear my own heartbeat as she slid her glasses down her nose and began to examine the documents. "We found this in a safe deposit box your father kept at another bank, separate from the main will," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The paper made a dry sound when handled, like dry leaves being trampled in autumn, and I could see it was a handwritten letter in my father's shaky handwriting. There were also copies of business documents, partnership agreements, and what appeared to be a second version of the will, dated later than the one we knew. Sarah looked up at me with an expression that mixed surprise and professional caution. "Your father wrote here that he was sorry for treating you unfairly and that the family was hiding information about a property sale that took place 3 years before his death." The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, but even so, I felt my throat go completely dry. She continued flipping through the papers, and I saw numbers scrawled in pencil in the margins, values that ran into the millions. My first reaction was one of utter disbelief, as if I were watching a surreal film where someone who looked like me was the protagonist of an impossible twist. Was this real, or just a cruel trick of fate? I thought about my family's coldness all those years, The gatherings I was excluded from, the conversations that abruptly stopped when I got close. Now it was starting to make sense. They hadn't pushed me away out of dislike, but out of pure and simple greed. "What exactly is my father saying in this letter?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as my mind raced like a runaway horse. Sarah adjusted her glasses again and replied, "He claims that Marcus and Caroline convinced him to change the will while you were going through the divorce, arguing that you were emotionally unstable to handle the inheritance." Her words landed like stones in my stomach, and I felt an explosive mix of anger and revenge begin to boil inside my chest. The discovery that my own family had orchestrated my isolation to rob me of the inheritance that was rightfully mine was like being punched in the gut. For years, I had questioned my sanity, my worth as a person, my ability to maintain relationships, when in reality, I was merely the victim of a carefully planned betrayal. The metallic taste of anger filled my mouth, and I felt I had finally found the missing piece in the puzzle of my shattered life. Sarah closed the folder and looked me straight in the eye. "Mr. Richard, based on these documents, I believe we have sufficient evidence to challenge the current will. But I must warn you, your family will not accept this without a fight, and they have considerable resources to defend themselves." 3 days later, I decided it was time to test the waters. I called Caroline, feigning casualness, suggesting a cafe in the mall where we used to meet when we were still close decades ago. My sister hesitated for a few seconds. I could hear her breathing change rhythm through the phone, before accepting the invitation in an uncharacteristically high-pitched voice. The aroma of roasted coffee and cinnamon from the small bistro enveloped us as we sat down, but there was a palpable tension in the air, as if we were sitting on a powder keg waiting for the spark. Caroline nervously stirred the sugar in her coffee, avoiding my gaze as we chatted about trivialities like the weather and neighborhood news. Her blue eyes, which had always been our mother's, seemed restless and shifty, and I noticed her checking her phone every few minutes. When I finally decided to mention that I'd visited some lawyers to sort out my own documents, I saw her hands tremble slightly as she lifted the cup to her lips. The din of conversation around us created a sonic curtain that made our conversation more intimate and dangerous. "Why are you messing with these things now, Richard?" she asked, and for the first time in years, I heard a hint of genuine concern in her voice. Her brows furrowed the way they had when we were children, and she was hiding something from Mom, and I felt I was onto something. I answered vaguely, mentioning only that I wanted to better understand how the division of our father's assets worked, watching closely every micro-expression that passed across her face. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Caroline leaned forward, lowered her voice to a near whisper, and said, "Look, some things are better left alone, you know. Dad made his decisions for reasons known only to him." The scent of her perfume, the same sweet floral she'd worn since she was young, couldn't mask the sour odor of fear seeping from her pores. She continued, "Marcus has always been more involved in the business. Maybe it was only natural that Dad would trust him more with these complex financial matters." I realized I'd touched a nerve when she offhandedly mentioned Marcus's expertise in handling complex financial matters. No one had mentioned complexity until that moment. "What kind of complexity, Caroline?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, but she realized she'd said too much. Her face flushed slightly, and she began to stammer an evasive answer about investments and taxes, but I already had confirmation that there was much more to this simple story of family inheritance. The meeting ended with Caroline abruptly standing up, citing an urgent appointment that clearly hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. She left $10 on the table to cover her share of the bill, but left her purse on the chair and had to go back to get it, clearly shaken by the conversation. I watched her through the cafe window as she hurried across the parking lot, talking animatedly on her cell phone, probably already alerting Marcus to our conversation. That night, back home, I hung up the landline after receiving 3 unanswered calls from the same number, which I recognized as my mother's. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But inside my mind, I was absolutely certain. Sarah Anderson was right, and they really did have a lot to hide. The following Monday, I walked into Sarah Anderson's office with a determination I hadn't felt in decades. The leather chair creaked as I sat down, and the aroma of strong coffee mixed with the smell of letterhead created an air of seriousness that made me feel finally in control. Sarah had prepared a desk cluttered with documents arranged in meticulous stacks, each representing a piece of the puzzle my family had tried to hide for so long. Her hands moved with surgical precision between the folders, and I could tell she had worked all weekend to build our case. The Malibu property sold for $2.8 million 3 months before your father died, Sarah said, pointing to a deed I'd never seen before. The paper bore the official seal of the notary and was dated from a time when my father was supposedly too frail to make important decisions. She continued to unfold the scheme. Marcus and Caroline convinced your father to sign a general power of attorney, claiming it was only to facilitate the payment of medical bills. But they used this document to transfer several properties to a company from which you were excluded. The puzzle pieces began to fit together with frightening clarity, forming a portrait of betrayal far beyond anything I had imagined. There was also a downtown apartment valued at $1.2 million, shares in a tech company worth nearly $3 million, and a secret Swiss bank account holding over $500,000. Sarah showed me bank statements, sales contracts, and even emails between Marcus and Caroline discussing how to keep these transactions hidden from my eyes. The smell of fresh ink from the printed documents contrasted with the bitter taste of revelation spreading through my mouth. They completely underestimated your ability to investigate these irregularities, Sarah said, with a smile that blended professional admiration and a thirst for justice. I realized my family had seen me as a defeated man, broken by divorce and too isolated to pose any threat to their plans. For years, I'd played the role of the failed brother, the troubled son who couldn't fit into the family's mold of success. Now that image worked in my favor. They never expected me to have the courage or intelligence to dismantle their scheme. Sarah explained our strategy to me. First, we would request a full audit of all my father's assets, including property sold in the last 5 years of his life. Then we would challenge the validity of the general power of attorney, claiming that my father was not mentally fit to sign such important documents. The sound of pages turning echoed in the quiet office as she showed me legal precedent similar to my case. Her eyes shone with the excitement of someone who had found a virtually unassailable case, a battle she could win with her eyes closed. When I left the office that afternoon, I carried with me a heavy briefcase containing copies of all the relevant documents. The physical weight of the material in my hands seemed to symbolize the weight of the responsibility I now assumed. It was no longer just about money, but about exposing the truth and restoring my dignity after decades of humiliation. My family had bet that I would remain quiet and submissive forever, but they were about to discover they had awakened the wrong lion. That night, while sorting through the papers at home, I came across a specific clause in the original will that completely changed the game. My father had left explicit instructions that if any irregularities in the management of his estate were discovered, the entire inheritance was to be redistributed equally among his 3 children, with severe financial penalties for those responsible for the fraud. The first sign that my family had discovered my legal dealings came one Thursday, when Marcus showed up at my door unannounced. It had been over 2 years since we'd seen each other in person, and the first thing I noticed was how much older he had become. His graying hair, the deep wrinkles around his eyes, and a slightly stooped posture that betrayed the weight of worries. The expensive perfume he always wore couldn't mask the sour smell of nervousness emanating from his skin, and his hands trembled slightly when he asked to come in. The sound of his own footsteps echoed in the hallway as I led him to the living room, feeling that the roles had finally reversed and he was the uncomfortable visitor. "Richard, we need to talk like brothers," he said, sitting on the edge of the chair as if ready to bolt at any moment. His voice had a honeyed tone I hadn't heard since we were kids, when he'd try to get me to take the blame for some mischief he'd pulled. I offered him coffee, but he nervously declined, preferring to get straight to the point that was clearly eating at him. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated his sweaty face, and I could see small beads of perspiration forming on his forehead, despite the air conditioning being on. "We heard you've been talking to lawyers," Marcus continued, trying to maintain a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. His strategy was obvious. First, he'd try the brotherly approach, appealing to family ties they themselves had severed decades ago. He mentioned our childhood, the backyard games, the family Christmases, as if those memories could erase years of betrayal and humiliation. But every word out of his mouth rang as false as a $3 coin, and I remained silent, watching him struggle in the trap he'd created. When he realized nostalgia wasn't working, Marcus changed tactics and resorted to direct emotional pressure. "Mom is very fragile, Richard. This kind of stress can be fatal for a woman her age," he said, leaning forward in a desperate attempt to appear concerned. The irony was stark. For years, none of them had cared about my emotional stress, my mental health, or the impact family isolation had on my life. Now, suddenly, they wanted me to consider the well-being of the family that had rejected me for decades. "What about my well-being, Marcus?" I finally asked, breaking the silence I'd maintained since he'd arrived. I could see the relief in his eyes when he realized I was finally answering, but I also saw the fear as he realized my question carried a burden of resentment built up over years. I answered his own questions in a controlled manner. "How many times have you worried about me when you excluded me from family gatherings, when you treated me as if I were invisible, when you made it clear I had no value to this family?" The conversation took a more direct turn when Marcus realized the emotional blackmail wasn't working. "Look, maybe we can find a solution that benefits everyone," he said, and for the first time he sounded like the businessman he always was. His posture changed. He leaned back in his chair, and he took on a more professional tone, talking about fair division and out-of-court settlements. The smell of his sweat had changed. It was no longer pure fear, but the calculated perspiration of someone negotiating. I could tell Marcus had come prepared to make an offer, but I also knew that any amount he mentioned would only be a fraction of what I actually owed. When he finally left, realizing I wouldn't give in to pressure or false displays of affection, he blurted out a sentence that revealed his true intentions. "I hope you know what you're getting into, Richard. Lawsuits can drag on for years, and we have the resources for a long war." The mask had completely slipped, and there was the real Marcus, not the concerned brother, but the adversary who considered me a threat to the carefully laid plans they had built around my exclusion. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and palpable tension when I entered that December morning. My family was already positioned across the room, Marcus in his $3,000 navy suit, Caroline in a conservative black dress, and my mother wearing the pearl necklace my father gave her for their last wedding anniversary. The click of the clerk's heels echoed in the quiet room, broken only by the occasional whisper of lawyers organizing their documents. I felt my heart race as our eyes met for the first time in months, and I realized there was no more room for pretense or false family courtesies. Sarah Anderson was impeccable in her gray suit, and the confidence in her movements contrasted sharply with the visible nervousness of my family's lawyer. She had spent weeks preparing every detail of our presentation, organizing the evidence chronologically, and constructing an irrefutable narrative about the secret Swiss bank account I had suffered. The scent of her discreet perfume, mixed with the smell of fresh paper from the petitions, created a professional atmosphere that reassured me. When she stood to make her opening statement, the silence in the room became deafening, and I could see Marcus fiddling nervously with the gold pen he always carried. "Your Honor, this case isn't just a run-of-the-mill inheritance dispute," Sarah began, her clear voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. She methodically presented the evidence about the secret Swiss bank account, the emails between Marcus and Caroline plotting my exclusion, and the fraudulent sale of the $2.8 million Malibu estate. The judge, a gray-haired man with over 30 years of experience, jotted down every detail as he adjusted his reading glasses. I could see the exact moment his expression changed from neutral to genuine surprise when Sarah presented my father's handwritten letter confessing to being manipulated. My family's reaction was instant and revealing. Caroline began to cry silently, wiping away her tears with a tissue that trembled in her hands. Marcus maintained a mask of indignation, but his sweaty hands left visible marks on the mahogany table he was leaning on. My mother, for her part, remained still as a statue, but I could see her breath quicken when Sarah mentioned the $500,000 that had been transferred to an account in Caroline's name just 2 weeks before my father's death. The scent of fear emanated from their side of the room like an invisible cloud I could practically taste. Their lawyer, a burly man named Peterson, attempted a defense based on my alleged emotional instability during the divorce. He argued that my father had made sensible decisions to protect the family wealth from someone going through a severe personal crisis. But Sarah had anticipated this strategy and presented medical reports proving my sanity, as well as testimonies from neighbors and former co-workers about my level-headed behavior throughout the divorce. The sound of the pages turning as she dismantled each of their arguments created an almost musical rhythm of approaching victory. When it was time for my testimony, I felt a strange calm wash over me. For decades, I had been silenced, ignored, and treated as if my version of events didn't matter. Now, under oath and before the law, I finally had the chance to tell my full story. I described in detail the family gatherings I'd been excluded from, the conversations that abruptly stopped when I arrived, and the persistent coldness that had made me question my own sanity for years. My voice remained steady as I spoke, and I could tell my words were making an impact on both the judge and the jury. The climax came when Sarah presented the secret clause of the original will, the one that provided for the full redistribution of the inheritance in the event of proven fraud. The judge called a 15-minute recess to review this specific document, and when he returned, his expression was one of someone who had made a final decision.
After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, this court finds that systematic fraud has been proven in the administration of the deceased's estate. Judge Richardson's voice echoed through the courtroom with the authority of someone who had spent 3 decades deciding the fate of feuding families. The silence that followed was so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat, as well as the muffled sound of Caroline sobbing softly. Marcus had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles were white. The scent of victory was a sweet aroma that mingled with the palpable terror emanating from the opposite side of the room. The transfers made without the plaintiff's knowledge or consent constitute misappropriation of property that rightfully belonged to him. The judge continued, flipping through the documents with precise movements. Caroline could no longer control her tears, and her tears fell onto the black dress she had carefully chosen to look respectable before the court. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but I could see a vein pulsing in his forehead as the reality of the situation crystallized before his eyes. My mother remained motionless, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a glass of water. The ruling was even more devastating than I had imagined. Not only was the will annulled, but all the properties sold illegally were to be returned to the original estate. The total amount to be redistributed amounts to $9.7 million, including interest and penalties for mismanagement, the judge declared, and I heard Caroline gasp audibly as the financial reality of the defeat hit my family hard. Sarah discreetly squeezed my arm, a silent gesture of professional celebration, as I tried to process that decades of humiliation were being officially acknowledged and rectified. Each family member's reaction was unique and revealing of their personalities. Marcus stood abruptly and left the courtroom without a word, his heavy footsteps echoing in the marble hallway as he tried to escape the reality of his defeat. Caroline remained seated, sobbing uncontrollably, while her lawyer tried to console her with empty words about possible appeals. My mother looked at me for the first time in years with an expression that mixed hatred, disbelief, and a hint of what seemed like grudging respect. The sound of the judge's gavel striking 3 times to end the session sounded like heavenly music to my ears. As we left the courthouse, Sarah explained the next steps. In addition to the redistribution of assets, Marcus and Caroline will each have to pay a fine of $75,000 for fraudulent administration. The winter sunlight beat down on our faces as we walked up the granite steps of the courthouse, and I felt for the first time in decades that the future was completely within my control. I took a deep breath of the cool afternoon air, savoring not only the legal victory, but most of all the feeling of having my dignity finally restored in the face of those who tried to destroy me. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. My family had spent years treating me like a failure incapable of fighting for my rights, when in reality, I was the only one brave enough to face the truth. They bet that I would remain quiet and submissive forever, passively accepting the role of black sheep they had imposed on me. But they completely underestimated my resilience and my thirst for justice, turning their own arrogance into the tool of their destruction. That night, when I arrived home carrying the court victory certificate, I found 14 messages on my phone, some from Marcus trying to negotiate a belated settlement, others from Caroline begging for forgiveness, and even a frantic call from my mother offering a family talk. But the time for family talks was long gone, and now all that remained was to decide how to use my new position of power. 6 months after my court victory, I found myself, for the first time in decades, planning a future that seemed infinitely possible. The smell of fresh coffee in my new Santa Monica home mingled with the sea breeze wafting through the picture window, creating an atmosphere of peace I'd forgotten existed. With $9.7 million finally in my hands, I could realize dreams I'd buried during years of financial and emotional humiliation. The sound of waves crashing on the shore replaced the oppressive silence of my old home, and each morning I woke with the refreshing feeling of having complete control over my destiny. My first decision was strategic and symbolically powerful. I created a $2 million foundation to support people who, like me, had been victims of financial abuse at the hands of their families. The foundation's offices were in downtown Los Angeles, in a modern glass building that reflected the sunlight like a beacon of hope for those needing legal help to cope with their own family betrayals. I hired Sarah Anderson as the foundation's legal director, offering her a salary of $300,000 a year, a sum that reflected both my gratitude and my commitment to the cause. The aroma of new paper and fresh ink on the foundation's founding documents smelled sweet of revenge transformed into purpose. The second phase of my plan involved carefully calculated investments that would ensure not only my financial security, but also my ultimate emotional independence. I purchased 2 commercial properties in Beverly Hills for a total of $3.2 million, whose monthly rent of $45,000 would provide me with substantial passive income for the rest of my life. I also invested $1.5 million in technology stocks that Sarah had meticulously researched, diversifying my portfolio so that not even a severe economic downturn could return me to the vulnerable position I'd occupied for so many years. The most satisfying moment came when I finally agreed to meet my family for a final conversation, not because I needed their forgiveness, but because I wanted them to clearly understand how the game had changed forever. I arranged the meeting at my foundation office, in an environment where I was completely in control and they were the uncomfortable visitors. Caroline arrived 20 minutes late, with dark circles under her eyes and unkempt hair that betrayed sleepless nights. Marcus entered with the hunched posture of someone who had lost not only money, but also the very identity built on superiority and arrogance. "I didn't come here to hear apologies," I said at the outset, watching my firm voice echo in the spacious room as they settled into their leather chairs like scolded children. I explained my new reality. The foundation was growing, my investments were yielding more in a month than I used to in a year, and most importantly, I had found an inner peace that decades of therapy had failed to provide. The scent of their fear was almost palpable in the air-conditioned room, but this time I felt no pity, only the cold satisfaction of someone who had finally earned the respect they always deserved. I closed the meeting with carefully rehearsed words that came from my heart with the force of an undeniable truth. You bet that I would be too weak to fight for my rights, but you discovered that you completely underestimated my resilience.
I rose from the Italian leather executive chair that had cost $8,000, a luxury I could easily afford now, and faced them for the last time as members of my family. My mother tried to say something about forgiveness and starting over, but I politely but firmly interrupted. Forgiveness is something you will have to find within yourselves, because I have already found something far better, the peace of a life lived with dignity. Today, at 66, I wake up every morning knowing that every choice I make is my own, every dollar I spend was honestly earned, and every relationship I cultivate is based on genuine mutual respect. Revenge turned into resilience. Family betrayal became the foundation for a new family of people I consciously chose, and the robbery I suffered ultimately taught me the true value of independence. My story proves that it's never too late to rewrite the ending of your life as long as you have the courage to face those who preyed on your weakness. What about you, listening to this story? Have you ever experienced a situation where people close to you tried to take advantage of your trust? How did you react when you discovered a betrayal by family or friends? Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't the destruction of another, but our own overcoming and success. Leave a comment. Do you believe forgiveness is always necessary, or are there situations where justice is more important? If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our stories.